Well, I promised you last week that I have an interesting person that I'm going to interview today, and I am living up to that promise. Now, you'll notice a couple of things about this interview. As with most of my interviews, you will see me and then you will see them, or the person being interviewed. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is I'm not technical enough to get both in the same lighting. The second is, with everybody that I've set up an interview with, without exception, every one of them just looks better than I do. You know, now they'll say, oh, no, that's not true, but they know doggone well it is. And I hate that. So you're going to see me, and then you're going to see the person being interviewed every time from now on. I got a real good look at me last week when I did that skydive, and some of the parts about it are not exactly attractive. So, be that as it may, I've got a friend of mine today. You're going to like what he tells you. He is a lesson in perseverance. That's basically what I want to get to. But he's got a big story to tell. It's Martin Hegwood. He's an author, lawyer, attorney for the state. Was in the shrimping business with his folks earlier with a little tiny guy down in Pascagoula, but he'll get to that. So I'm gonna turn it over to him now, and I'll be asking some questions. But he just finished telling me a story about Faulkner in Pascagoula. He's full of those kinds of stories. So, well, we'll listen to him, see what happens. But I can't figure out how to turn this guns around. Wait a minute. I got to. Okay, Martin, we may have to do this whole thing over again because you're dealing with a technical giant over here.
Well, you won't get any help from me, I'm afraid.
Well, your own.
You know.
Tell us first where you're from Pascagoula originally, right?
I'm originally from Pascagoula, right? I live down there. My folks moved to Pascagoula in 1932. So I was born in 51. We've been living there about 20 years. And we still have the same property down there where I grew up. I go down there a lot. Since retirement, in fact, I'm going down there tomorrow and spend about a week. I do a lot with the Pascagoula Historic Preservation Society. I have worked with the people down there on various projects, such as the restoration of the LaPointe Krebs house, which is the oldest house in the South, basically. It's just down the bayou from where I live. And I worked a long time last year, in fact, practically all year, on trying to have Pascagoula designated as a World War II heritage city by the National Park Service. So I did extensive research on Pascagoula during the World War II era and compiled it and sent it was about a 25,000 word mini book to the National Park Service. And of course, we're still waiting on their decision as to whether or not to designate Pascagoula as a World War II heritage city. But I have high hopes and expectations that they will.
Well, so you were born in Pascagoula, right?
I was born there. Right.
Stayed there until what? You went to college, huh?
Stayed there until I went to college. I went to Ole Miss.
Or a Sigma Nu too, by the way.
Yes, I was a Sigma Nu. Sigma Nu was big in Pascagoula. That was a big frat for that town. I went right after Hurricane Camille. Hurricane Camille hit in August, and I went maybe 3 or 4 weeks later. I went up there. I knew absolutely nothing about Ole Miss. I'd have been up there to maybe one party, and that was with a group of people, and so I really didn't know my way around the campus at all. I had an aunt from Jonesboro, Arkansas. She was a great aunt, my grandmother's sister, and she had come down after Camille to help us. Our house wasn't torn up or anything like that, but we were without power, without water, and so there was an awful lot to be done. A lot of neighbors needed help. So my Aunt Sally from Jonesboro came down there, and she had this big Chrysler New Yorker, and she said, well, I can give you a ride back up to Ole Miss. So I took off to Ole Miss with her, and I had 2 great big Samsonite suitcases, the big old brown things that you see. That's where all my worldly belongings were in those suitcases. And I had no idea where I was supposed to go, so she pulled that big Chrysler New Yorker in right in front of the Lyceum, right in front of those columns, and put me out. I had 2 suitcases. I was just walking around campus, had no idea where I was supposed to go. And of course, one smart aleck upperclassman told me the wrong way. I found myself probably over on Sorority Row as near as I could tell. I finally made it to where I was supposed to be, which was a dormitory to check in. But I was I was 17 years old at the time. I started classes up there when I was 17, which was way too young to be going up to Ole Miss, I can tell you that. But I did. You know, I had a great time. I really had a pretty good, I guess a pretty good varied education. I changed majors so many times that I ended up, instead of having the mandatory or required 124 college hours, I ended up with 152 college hours. So I just took a little of this, a little of that. I mean, one time I took 21 hours in a semester. There was no rhyme or reason to it. Like everything else in my life, there has been no master plan. It's just bounced from pillar to post. But I had a good time doing it.
Well, you've done some interesting things in that. Well, when you got out, you went to law school.
Well, I did. I never thought that anything would. I thought that I was going to want to stay at Ole Miss forever. Nothing could get me out of there. I was wrong. Law school would do that. Once I got into law school, I knew from the first minute that I was in the wrong place. I mean, it was just something just didn't jibe, and I have no reason. I had no reason really to go other than as a small boy, I decided I wanted to be a lawyer. I didn't have any advice on that or anything like that, but I just never looked to the left or the right, and then suddenly it became time to go to law school. Of course, there was also 3 more football seasons involved, and I was enjoying myself up there. And I made a pretty good LSAT score and got in without any trouble. And like I said, when I got in, I started in the summer, and I knew immediately that I shouldn't have been there, but somehow I stuck it out. It was a blind grading system. The only thing I can figure is that this contract teacher we had up there, who was notorious for flunking people out of school, he must have gotten my exam mixed up with somebody. I mean, there's some poor son of a gun out there who really wanted to be a lawyer who didn't make it because he got my exam instead. But I made a good score on it, and next thing I knew, I really had one of the better GPAs after the first semester. I took 6 hours of contract and 3 hours of criminal law, and I went to an upperclassman who was a senior in law school at the time. He practices law in Pascagoula right now, and asked him. I told him, look, this just isn't for me. He said, oh well, look, you already made it past the tough part. That's where they bust you out is the first year. Keep up, and you'll get the hang of it, and you'll like it. Well, after the first semester, I was in the same situation, but I had so many they call them quality points. I had enough to where I probably was not going to flunk out of the school. So it was in for in for a dollar, in for a dime. I was so far along, I just decided to stick it out, and so I limped to the finish line. I really limped to the finish line. They had a policy where they'd tell you don't have to go to class, so I take them at their word. I wouldn't go to class. I had one professor in particular who was sending out word to know if Mr. Hegwood was still enrolled in school, and I sent word back that he told me that if I thought I could wait until the end, take the exam, that more power to me. I said, well, that's my plan, and of course, and I did, and I won't say I set the world on fire, but I did get by. But I got out, and I really didn't think I wanted to practice law. And I went to Pascagoula, and I got in with a little firm. It had its good points and had its bad points. But overall, I really wasn't something that I could see myself doing for the next 50 years. Just didn't want to do it. And luckily, I was not married, didn't have that obligation. And so I just decided I'd quit. There were a couple of things in the firm that I didn't particularly like, and I was young and brash and didn't really care that much, and so I just walked out. This was in April. I say walked out. I mean I didn't just walk out one day, storm out, but I did quit. with the plan that I was going to go up to Jackson just to find something to do. Well, this was about April. I was dating this girl in Pascagoula who was teaching French at the high school down there, and we met at a mutual friend's wedding. And I had a sailboat, so we went sailing that summer. And we sailed from April until the money ran out, sometime around July and August. And I decided it's time to go up to Jackson. And why Jackson, I don't know, but I did. Well, I had a few little odd jobs. I was selling jewelry at Carter's Jewelry for a while, and I just had small little sales jobs and things like that. And I kept looking for a place to apply for work. And I'd been up there a couple of weeks, and I was staying with a friend, sleeping on the couch. One of those things when you're a young man, you can do that kind of stuff. And at noon, an ad came on the television, and it was Goldie Revitz with some kind of one of these local swap shop or where people post ads and stuff like that. It was on WLPT. And she said Governor William Winter, who had just been elected, Governor William Winter, is looking for people to fill his positions on his staff. And if you were interested in applying, call Bill Cole. Well, it just so happened I knew Bill Cole from Ole Miss. So I called Bill and asked him if he had any jobs and told him what the situation was. And he said, well, do you know anybody that knows William Winter? And I did. He was a good friend of ours, good friend of yours. He was an attorney who was a Sigma Nu. He was an older guy, but he and Winter, he was older than I was. He and Winter were big buddies. So he put in a word, and I got a job with William Winter. And the next thing I knew, I was on the governor's staff. Well, it really was the Boys of Spring. This was that famous Boys of Spring type thing, with Malpas and Mavis and Bill Cole and Marshall Bennett and David Cruz and all that. We were all in our 20s. We were all in our 20s. Well, when we had our first staff meeting, and like I said, I barely knew Governor Winter. Got to know him real well. I like him a lot. He was a very fine gentleman, and we became very good friends. But he was kind of looking around for people to fill positions, and he said, well, who knows anything about criminal law? Well, I had been down in Pascagoula. I had been an assistant district attorney for just about a 4-month period, an interim period. It was just a temporary type thing. I looked around, nobody was holding up their hands, and I said, well, I was an assistant DA for 3 months. He said, okay, you got it. Said from that point on, I was the liaison from the governor's office to the Parchment, to the penitentiary up at Parchment. I also handled requests for clemency that came in. I would review them and all this kind of stuff. And I became the extradition hearing officer for the state of Mississippi. You would hear, when someone from Texas came to Mississippi, they were arrested. Texas sent a request for extradition, and I'd hold the hearing. And really, there's not much hearing to it. All you do is just make sure that it's the right person and that the paperwork is filled out correctly. That's about all you do. You don't pass on their guilt or innocence. So I was a state extradition hearing officer, and I also went up to Parchment about once a month. I'd spend the night up there. They have a guest house, and it got to be that was a real experience. The thing that would strike you about a penitentiary is just how young everybody is. There was a bunch of kids, and you forgot it was sort of a farm. I mean, it wasn't like you were in a big lockdown or anything like that. Everybody was walking around playing basketball. You'd get to talk to them, and you just felt real confident walking around the place. And it changed my whole attitude toward a lot of that stuff. I found out that I know that there are a lot of people who need to be in prison, but there are a lot of people up there that it's not really doing anybody any good. I mean, that's just a shame, and I don't know what the alternative is. I'm certainly no bleeding heart liberal on this business, but we're locking an awful lot of people up for some minor offenses that probably ought to do something else. But anyway, that's another sideline to go down. After about a couple of years with Governor Winter, the time was running out because they couldn't. The governors couldn't see themselves at the time. So the standard pattern was that everybody would start looking for a job after about 2 years, and I did. And it turns out that I had there was an oil and gas boom, and so I found this friend who was into oil and gas land. He was a lease hound. He'd go out and lease land. and I got a job with him. And so I'd go to all over the southeast, mainly in Louisiana, Texas, here in Mississippi, and lease property. Lease oil rights for oil and gas. I got to where I was doing a lot of curative work, and what that is, that's basically detective work. Curative, before they sign an oil lease, they make sure they know exactly who owns every smidgen of minerals under that land. And I mean, it can be a 132nd interest, and they want to know who it is. So you'd have to go out and find people who knew all these families and find out how many children they had and where they lived and when they lived there and all this kind of stuff. So you go out in the country and you'd find old folks who had been there for a long time, and you'd get them to give an affidavit as to, yes, I knew so-and-so, and yes, he had 4 children, and they would name them and they'd talk about it. So you'd get all this down to get them to sign it. One of the best sources I ever had was an old fellow over there close to Meridian. This was in Pachuta, Quitman County.
Lauderdale.
No, it was Jasper County, I think, it was south of Lauderdale, south of Clark. But his name was Broadhead, and he was 91 years old. He lived with his sister, who was 94 years old. The two of them lived in an old dog trot cabin out in the middle of nowhere. They didn't even have running water. And it was one of these dog trots. It was a log cabin. They were very, very nice people. Well, he was a rural mail carrier for 60 years. He knew every single thing about everything that every family had done for a 60-year period. In other words, he was pure gold. Well, it turns out that his 94-year-old sister didn't want him drinking anything, and he liked this cheap brand of scotch. It's called Highland Mist or something like that. So I went up to Meridian, and I bought about 50 little half-pint bottles of Highland Mist scotch. And Mr. Broadhead and I would go out to Mariah Springs to get water for him and his sister. And that's where I first gave him a couple of bottles of this scotch. And so from then on, when I'd go over there, I'd say, Mr. Broadhead, is it time to go get some water? He said, I think it is. So we'd go out there. I'd make the swap. He'd give me the story, and I'd get it all signed up, notarized. So now that was a good job. I haven't had too many jobs that I enjoyed, but that was a good one. But like so many other things, I didn't have, sometimes you're not in control of your own destiny. OPEC flooded the market. The price went down to nothing, so people stopped drilling, and that ran out. Well, it was really kind of a good thing it did, because that was about the time that this little French teacher that I told you about, we went sailing together, she and I had decided to get married. And I found a job in Jackson. And so I got that job, steady work, office setting, and we got married, and then I just had a series of jobs. I finally ended up with the Secretary of State's office as sort of an all-purpose lawyer. And when I say all-purpose lawyer, I went in with Eric Clark. Eric was a friend of mine from the legislature. We didn't go to school or anything like that, but we were the same age and sort of had some of the same interests and kind of knew each other. And he needed somebody he could talk to who was an attorney. Eric is not an attorney, he's a PhD. So my job basically would be to take all the legalese, all the documents and all this kind of stuff written in legalese, translate them into English, and then tell Eric what was going on. He also sent me over to the legislature, start dealing with the legislature. I was not exactly a lobbyist because, I didn't have the standard accoutrements that a lobbyist has. I didn't have an American Express card or anything like that. Didn't take them out and buy them lunches or anything. I would just go over there and follow legislation that would have an effect on the Secretary of State's office, or that the Secretary of State's office would be expected to carry out. So all these public lands and corporations and charities and pre-need funerals and all the various agencies within the Secretary of State's office, I'd keep an eye out for it. And I'd go talk to the legislators, and they'd ask me, can y'all do this? What would it take? Would you need any more people to handle it, and all this kind of stuff? So I did that for him. And then when Delbert Hoseman took over, he kept me on, and I did the same thing for Delbert for a while, and then, became retirement age.
All right, now this is kind of where you had the first idea about writing a book.
Right? Well,
you, up to now, everything has been minutely planned.
Mm-hmm.
in your life that
Right.
you followed it exactly the way you scripted it out, right?
Yeah, right. Well, what happened on the book writing, that had occurred some years before. One of the jobs that I had was the head of a trade association, and I'm not going to name the trade association. It was an absolutely miserable job. And the reason I say that is got nothing wrong with the people, good folks, but I've always heard you don't want to work for a church, a country club, or a trade association. And the reason is because you'll have some people in all those organizations who don't have anything better to do than to try to run the association. And it's like any other thing. About 10% of the people give you 90% of your problems. Well, I had followed this guy that they finally had to run off, and about half the people wanted to keep him, and half of them wanted to run him off. And I was the one they chose. I didn't know. They didn't tell me all about that beforehand. So it was a house divided to begin with, and it was just terrible. I mean, I had people trying to. It was just dirty tricks. I mean, it was bad. I learned an awful lot about human nature, but I was so miserable that they sent me off to the trade association's national convention, and it was at the Del Coronado Hotel in San Diego, California. It's the biggest wooden building in the world. That's where they filmed the movie Some Like It Hot with Marilyn Monroe in it. It is a beautiful hotel right there on the Pacific Ocean. The food is excellent. It's wonderful. Well, I got out there a little bit ahead of time, and so I had to wait for the president of the association to get there and to make sure that their room was all right. And the president's wife had this. It was a standard routine. Every time she'd go into a hotel, something was wrong with the room, and you had to get it switched over. It was going to happen if she'd gone to the Ritz-Carlton. It was going to happen anywhere. So I had to get them all settled and take them. I say them, the president and the board of directors. There was about a dozen of them. And I had this fancy meal, and I was running around taking care of them, and it was just driving me crazy. And so finally, at the end of this thing, it was about 10 o'clock at night, I was completely exhausted, completely kicked off, was in a horrible mood, and just dejected. I mean, this job was just horrible. And so I went out. I was wearing a suit, and it was 10 o'clock at night, and I walked down the street. There was a liquor store in San Diego, and I bought a bottle of wine. And I took the bottle of wine and I went out to the beach, and just sitting in the suit, and I was sitting down on the sand in the suit, popped open that bottle of wine, just sitting there drinking wine, looking out over the Pacific Ocean at this lighthouse. And I was wondering, something's wrong with this picture. I was in one of the most beautiful places in the world. I was on somebody's expense account. I had just finished eating a $100 meal, and I was completely miserable. Something wasn't right with this picture. And then all of a sudden, it was like a voice came to me. It said, Hegwood, all your life you've been talking about being a writer, but you're not doing it because you don't have the guts to try it. You're not going to jump out of that airplane. You're not going to pull the trigger and do it because you got a fear of failure. You're afraid you can't do it. And at that point, I got up, took what was left of the bottle of wine, went into the Del Coronado Hotel, got some hotel stationery, and started writing. And I started writing about this character I had in mind. Turned out to be Jack Delmas. But I didn't know where the writing was going, but I figured I'd start with his life story. And then I started having a setting for it, the Mississippi Gulf Coast, because that's where I knew best. And I just decided that I'd gone through 3 years of law school, which I considered misery, and I was going to spend the next 3 years every day doing something to make myself become a writer. I was going to sit there and write something every day, read something every day, and make myself into a writer. And, after I gave it that shot, if it didn't work, at least I'd given it a shot. The first week was really tough. Every single day looking at a blank piece of paper is really, really tough. After that, it got to where it became a routine part of my day. And I got to where I was writing something every day, and the pages started piling up. And then I started reading about writing, and I started going to seminars, and I started joining writers' clubs and things like that. And I read all kinds of mysteries. I decided mysteries. I didn't read that many mysteries at the time, and really still don't. I don't read a lot of mysteries. But it was the best way into print. At the time, romances were the easiest way to get into print. Well, I couldn't do that. I just
Well, I got an 8 and 10 by Technicolor of you writing romance stuff. I talked
yeah,
to Linda about that and see if you know enough to be able to.
yeah, right, right. But romances are they come formulaic. They follow a formula. At the time, and I'm talking about a formula to the extent they'd say it is going to be so many thousands of words, like 70,000 words, and by the 5,000th word, you have to have introduced the heroine, the female lead, the male lead, and you have to have so many elements in there. And by this page, you have to have it. I mean, it's just like you churn them out just by formula. And people can do it, and they make a lot of money doing it. But I really didn't want to do that. The second number of books sold were mysteries. The second number of titles printed were mysteries. So I decided I was going to write a mystery because I think my odds would have been better then. And it turns out that was right. Now, there's a difference between number of titles put out and number of books sold. The number of titles put out, the most were mysteries. The number of books sold, the most were thrillers. There is a difference. In a mystery, you don't even know who the bad guy is until the next to last chapter most of the time. It's a big whodunit up until then. In a thriller, from the first chapter, practically, you know who the good guy is, who the bad guy is, and then it becomes a 90,000 word chase scene to see if the good guy's going to get out of the clutches of the bad guy who's trying to kill him. That's basically a thriller. But that's what sells. John Grisham writes thrillers. He doesn't write mysteries. I mean, you know who the good guy and the bad guy is by the first 2 chapters. So there's a distinction there that I wish I had known at the time, but I didn't. But anyway, I decided to write mysteries, and I decided to read as many of them as I could, and I got to where I enjoyed it. There are some excellent mystery writers. I mean, right now, I think that my favorite writer who's still working today is James Lee Burke. And James Lee Burke is without peer. Nobody can touch him right now. And the good thing about it is, for my age, James Lee Burke is 85 or 86 years old, and he's still churning them out. And they're not, and he's not losing a step. I mean, he's
the product of that person. Hold this up. This is the first book that you came out with.
Yeah, Big Easy
Back Road.
Yeah.
And what I really wanted to get across in this perseverance thing is, after you had the manuscript of the book written, what kind of steps did you go through to get that published? Now, I know that's a long story, but shorten it as best you can and let us know what you went through.
Yeah. Once you get your book written, then you have to have a good synopsis. You have to, and that's hard. I mean, you have to come up with either a 1-page or a 10-page or a 5-page synopsis. The publishing houses will tell you what you have to do, and that's really tough. Writing synopsis is really tough. You have to come up with a good pitch letter, a good they call it a query letter, and that has to be no more than 1 page and about 4 or 5 paragraphs, and you have to introduce yourself, tell in about 3 sentences what your book is about. Now, that's 80,000 words. This book's 80,000 words. Try to put that in 3 sentences. It takes months to do it right. It's really tough. Once you get the query and the query letter and the outline ready, then you're ready to go to war. Then you go and try to find agents who are interested. Now, this is before internet. This was before they had all this stuff on the internet. You had to go to books, Literary Marketplace, big book about that thick. And it's got all the agents out there and what kind of thing they represent. And I found every one of them that would represent, one of them that say, I represent mysteries. And sometimes they just say, I represent fiction. Well, that was good enough for me. If they said fiction, that was good enough. I started sending these things out. Like I'd pick out 5 agents. And usually what happened, people would go to the Literary Marketplace and they'd start at A, and they'd pick out the agents starting with A and go through that way to the alphabet. Well, I figured that those guys whose name started with A and B get a lot of letters because of that. So I started at the Z's and started working back this way. And it must have worked because my agent, the first one I got, his name was Jimmy Vines, Vines. So, he's pretty far back to the rear. But before I got to Mr. Vines, I'd accumulated over 80 rejection letters from this thing. You have to be able to take a rejection on this. And you have to realize that it's not really, most of the time, it's really not a rejection of your work. It's the fact that they've got all the mystery writers they can use at the time, or they've already like published a New Orleans novel, and they don't want to have 2 or 3 of them. I mean, there are various reasons why they reject your book, other than just that they don't like it. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that it's any good, but it can be good and still get rejected. But you have to keep on plugging about this, because you only have to get one yes. You can get all the no's in the world. James Lee Burke, who I was talking about, he is such a good talent that I don't see how anybody can fail to read anything that he puts out and not see that he's got talent. His first book was called The Lost Get Back Boogie. He got 99 rejection letters. James Lee Burke got 99 rejection letters.
So there's a lesson in that.
There is a lesson in that.
If you don't like rejection, that's probably not the right
No, that's right.
Right vocation for you. Well,
that's right. They say a relief pitcher and a defensive back has to have no memory whatsoever.
Right.
Has to forget that last play.
Well, so Big Easy Back Road came out, and I've read it, of course, and it was really a good one. And then behind that comes the Green-Eyed Hurricane.
Mm-hmm. The Green-Eyed Hurricane.
That one won the Mississippi Library Association Fiction Award that year.
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
So you're hitting your stride now.
Yeah. Well, the Mississippi Library Association puts out. People don't even know about this, and they need to advertise it more than what they do. But they put out a fiction award every year, and that means one book, either written by a Mississippian or about or set in Mississippi, a work of fiction, and they have this award, one a year, and they've had some, Eudora Welty won it, John Grisham, Nevada Barr, you name all these big names, and that was one of the awards that they got. The year I got it, I was real proud because I can't remember which. Of course, Grisham has a book every year, and I think Nevada Barr had one, and there was another big time mystery writer from Mississippi, but they chose mine, and I was real happy about that, mainly because it's a verification of, it's an affirmation that you're a real writer,
Yeah, and you are, of course, and they realize that. One quick question though, before we got to that, your agent had to go through some publishers and find somebody to put that first one out. St. Martin's Press in New York, right? Or how did that work?
Not many. To show you the value of an agent, this is not a good situation, but this is the way it is. In the old days, and I'm talking about the real old days, the days when you had people like Maxwell Perkins, who was William Faulkner's editor, and I think he was also Hemingway's editor. They had these agents and these editors who were just legendary. They would take young writers and they'd work with them, and they'd help them out, and they'd try to pat their back and all this kind of. Now they don't do a thing. I mean, it's got to be shovel ready, as they say. You got to do all the work, all the editing, everything's got to be ready to go. They're not going to do a thing for you. And it's not just me saying that. That's universal. Everybody who's in the writing business knows that. And it's gotten to the point where they don't even look at unsolicited manuscripts anymore. They go through agents. So agents are essential to the process. If you're going to go to one of the big publishing houses, it's essential. They won't even look at your stuff without an agent. So they're the gatekeepers. They're the ones that can get it done. Now, just to show you how good an agent or how important an agent is, I had received 80-something rejection letters. When that agent in New York got my manuscript for Big Easy Back Road, I sent it overnight by jet, and he got it, and he called me back like 9 days, 9 business days later. And he said, look, I've got 2 offers for this thing. I've got one from St. Martin's Press and one from Dutton Signet Penguin, the Penguin books. So he had 2 offers on that. Now, what that means is that those people, the way they do this thing, they'll approach a publishing house, the agent will. And so I've got this manuscript. I think it's pretty good. They'll find what they call an acquiring editor. That's the person who first sees the thing. And that acquiring editor will take it and they'll go to a meeting of editors. They'll have a dozen of these editors sitting around a big round table. And you'll say, I think we ought to buy this one. And it get copies made. And every one of those editors has to look around this thing, and they all have to kind of give their approval to it, or at least a vast majority of them, a big majority of them. And then once they do that and make that decision, then they'll offer you a contract. I got those 2 offers back in 9 days. They didn't go through that process for mine. They trusted my agent. Mm-hmm. They took his word. There's no way that they would have had the time to do what they normally do. So that's the value of an agent. Now they can get you in. Now my agent had some. He left the scene. I mean, not just me. He left the whole publishing scene shortly after that. I really don't know that story.
Well, let me ask you something else that I wondered about. You made a deal with St. Martin's Press mm-hmm. for 3 books, right? 2 books.
2 books.
Okay, let me ask. So it's 2 or 3. It doesn't matter. If the second book is a real bomb, mm-hmm. you don't like it, or mm-hmm. they don't like it, what happens in that kind of a?
Well, they don't have to offer you. I mean, they'll print it, or at least they'll. I guess they'll print it, or they'll buy you out. One of the 2.
So there's a contract for 2, and if they don't like it and you don't like it, they still are required to live up to their end of the bargain because you came up with a manuscript. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, you better make sure that you got a good agent to put that in there. But
yeah.
Okay. The contract that I had, yes, they did. Okay. But now the good thing about it is, a Big Easy Back Road. I thought that was. See, I like Big Easy Back Road. I mean, the reason that's my favorite because it was my first one. You know, John Grisham always says his favorite book is Time to Kill.
Mine too.
Because and it was.
It was.
And it was. I think it was his best. I think it was his best book. And the reason that he could write, the reason it's so often that your first book is your best book, is because there's no deadline pressure. You know, you could take years to write it. You can sit there and rework it and think about it and all this kind of stuff. And plus, you just, you know, it's the one you grew up with, so that's the one you like. His was A Time to Kill, and mine was this one. Now, A Time to Kill, you know, it only sold, what, I don't know, 1,000 copies or something like that.
Wasn't many, because he was selling them out of the trunk of his car.
Yeah, that's right. He was selling them out of the trunk of his car. Now, that's one thing, John, I was in law school with John Grisham, and I knew him in the legislature. So I can remember, I mean, we weren't real close friends, but we're friends. I haven't seen him in a while. But I can remember when he was going through all this kind of stuff. And he did something, he made it tough on Mississippi writers, on young Mississippi writers out there. Because when you sell a book, they automatically think that you're in the John Grisham League as far as money goes, you know. And you are as far as money went with Big Easy Back Road, but then came The Firm immediately after that, and that's a real once in a generation type story. It's a jackpot. Yeah. But he now they think they think that you're making a ton of money if you get a book published, and 2, they think you got like 5,000 copies of it sitting in your warehouse that you own that you just give out. You know what they don't realize is when you get a publishing contract, what they'll do is they'll give you 20 copies. That's it. And that's the author's copies, and you give them to family and friends and well, maybe not even friends, family, or keep them back for grandchildren or something like that. Every other one after that, if I gave somebody a book, I'd have to buy the book from the publisher just like a bookstore would. So, you know, we don't have Uh, the reason and they say, well, why about John Grisham? John Grisham bought those books. He went down and took what $5,000-$10,000 or something like that and bought those books. So he was I guess I didn't have enough confidence myself to make that kind of an investment, but he did it. He did it.
Well, after that one comes Massacre Island.
Yeah.
Well,
what you got, but getting back to what you were saying, yeah, they gave me a 2-book contract, and these are the 2 books. All right, these are the 2 books. And you say, well, what if it was a real bomb? Well, it just so happened that this one was actually the one that won the Mississippi Award. So, so we both got lucky on that. That was okay. At that point, they said, well, we'll give you 2 more. We'll give you a contract for 2 more books. So, and of course they increased the well, what am I trying to say? The bonus of the signing a little bit, and then I wrote Massacre Island, and that's set in Dauphin Island because Dauphin Island, Alabama. This was the original name of Dauphin Island, Alabama, Massacre Island. Bienville and D'Iberville named it that because they found a bunch of bones on the beach down there.
Well, then comes Jackpot Bay.
Yeah.
And then that's the latest one now.
Well,
we got about not 3 minutes left, but if what's next?
Well, in the world of fiction, I'm sort of, I think I've kind of gotten too old for it, to tell you the truth. Right now, they're looking for younger writers, and they'll tell you that. They'll tell you that it's real hard, because whether I know it or not, the things I'm interested in are just not what's current right now. So I've decided I'm going to write a book about William Faulkner, who is probably my all-time favorite writer. And it turns out that William Faulkner, as a young man, spent some time in Pascagoula when he was in his 20s, and this was the period of time when he was in New Orleans a lot. He would come over to Pascagoula and spend some time over there with friends, and he wrote at least 1 full book, maybe 2, and he started about 2 or 3 others in Pascagoula. He shifted from being a poet to being a writer of prose while he was in Pascagoula. And later on, 2 of his books, one of them he set in Pascagoula, The Wild Palms is set in Pascagoula. And in his book, the Mansion, which is the last of the Snopes trilogy, has a bunch of scenes in Pascagoula. So he used Pascagoula as a scene in a setting in some of his later books. Pascagoula meant a lot to him. He had a lot of fun down there. He had a good time down there, and he made a lot of friends. He honeymooned in Pascagoula, and so nobody's ever really. I mean, it's out there in plain view. Everybody knows about it, that he spent some time there, but they really don't know what the town was like, what he did while he was there. And so I'm trying to write a little mini biography of his time in Pascagoula. Having a great time with it.
Yeah. So when you don't have a deadline to finish it.
No.
So you passed the deadline.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't know if this thing will sell or not. It probably. Yeah, I have great hopes that it will, because people have a lot of interest in.
Well, whether it does or not, it's something you wanted to do.
Yeah.
And that's important. And the older I get, the more I realize that a lot of times, whether they like it or not, is really not that important. So.
Well, of course, Faulkner himself, that's where he really went on his tear when he started writing The Sound and the Fury. He had a book, Flags in the Dust, which he mainly wrote at Pascagoula, which was the beginning of the Yoknapatawpha County series. Couldn't sell it. And Flags in the Dust it came out 30 years later. He couldn't sell it. And so he said, well, if I can't write, if they don't want to buy it, I'm going to write what I want to write. And that was The Sound and the Fury. So he took the pressure off himself, commercial, and he came out with one of the all-time masterpieces, just because he let himself go and he did what he wanted to do.
So that's a lesson.
Yes. Yeah.
Good. All right. Look, I appreciate your coming in here. We're going to hopefully get this thing squared away and out, next week. You're a good man, sir, and a doggone few of us left. By the way, when we talk about being handsome or not, you look a lot better since you covered a lot of it up. All right. We're going to cut this short. So thank you, sir. I appreciate you coming.
Jim, always good talking to you.
Good.
Thank you.
See you. Well, I know that was a long interview, but we didn't really get started. That man is so full of stories. Martin Hegwood is one of the most interesting people I know, and a good friend. Now, next week, we're going to have somebody else that you'll find entertaining, I think, assuming everything works out like I hope it does. But until then, I'm Jim Ritchie. I'll see you again next time.